What's going on, everybody? Dots Gaming here, and today I'm bringing you an average player's PvP class difficulty tier list for World of Warcraft. So something that I do get asked about quite frequently is what classes are hardest or easiest to pick up going into PvP as a new player in World of Warcraft. And so I kind of want to make a list here for you guys today of the different melee, range, and healer specs in terms of which ones are the most difficult. So that's going to be our S tier, and then which ones are the least difficult, and that's going to be our C tier. Now we're going to be mostly looking at, I think, classes that are just hardest to play in their general comps to be successful with, and which take the most coordination and setup to really pull off. Every class obviously has their own skill caps, things that they need to do, but some classes are obviously a bit more difficult to pull off than others. And also, difficulty sometimes is in the eye of the beholder. Someone, might find a class easier than others, even though it's ranked to be more difficult or whatever. But you guys know what I'm trying to say. But this is just going to be my opinion on the classes that I think are the hardest versus the easiest. Now, starting with one of our easiest classes, should be no surprise to anybody. It is the Havoc Demon Hunter. You don't have a lot of buttons playing the Havoc DH, which I know for a lot of new players to WoW who maybe are not used to the sheer number of keybinds that we have, Havoc DH literally gives one of the class with the least amount of keybinds in the game. You don't have a lot you need to worry about. The spec is pretty streamlined, but the difficulty from it comes from the fact that you're insanely squishy. The damage is relatively simple to pull off, and the class kit is really straightforward, but you're squishy, so you do need to really know how to kite and play defensive. Otherwise, you are just going to get blown up. But I think in terms of, that's like the main difficult part of the class. Otherwise, it's really straightforward and definitely one of the easiest specs to pick up, especially for a new player. Another easy spec for a new player, in my opinion, is Frost Death Knight. The big skill cap from Frost Death Knight just comes from being able to set up your Death Grip the whole team in. You're going to do Blinding Sleet to blind everybody into Chill Streak. Once you basically nail that, you're good at playing a Frost TK. Obviously, there are some more nuances than that, but that's like the main crux of playing a Death Knight. It's a pretty straightforward class, not a lot of buttons. Again, when people always ask me when I'm streaming, if you do want to follow me, by the way, twitch.tv/dotsgaming, when they always ask me what classes are the easiest to play for melee, these are always the first two I recommend because they're very streamlined. They don't have a crap load of buttons, and they, once you can figure out how to execute their damage, it's just all about learning how to live and survive through your enemies' cooldowns, and then you'll pretty much be good to go. Now, moving up to our B tier, our first B tier spec is actually going to be Unholy. So I feel like Unholy rotationally isn't all that difficult once you kind of figure out how Festering Wounds works. The big difficulty for Unholy comes from the fact that you have a pet. I know some people find pet management difficult. I know personally, I am somebody that does. It's just not something I've ever personally liked or enjoyed. Granted, I do play a Windwalker monk too, and their pets are a little bit easier, but they're not permanent. They don't have to control them at all times. So and plus they don't have nearly as much that they do in terms of utility. So it's not as hard, but Unholy, the pet is that the cornerstone of what you do. You have to manage it quite a bit. And so if pet management really isn't your thing, Unholy is going to be a big challenge for you. So I think that's kind of what puts Unholy in a more of a difficult spot than Frost. It does have a little bit more too on the key binding side of things, but I think the pet management is what makes it a little bit more difficult and having to also manage something that isn't yourself. In terms of also in the B tier, we also have the Enhancement Shaman. Enhancement Shaman's burst rotation is pretty straightforward. You hit any buttons that are available to generate Maelstrom, and then when you have 5 stacks, you just fire, or to generate the Maelstrom weapon stacks, and then once you have 5, you can just fire off instant lightning bolts or instant healing surges. It's, the rotation is pretty straightforward. The difficult part with Enhancement Shaman is pretty much the difficulty that all the shamans have. Their specs, the skill cap comes from their utility. They have Wind Shear on a really low CD, which is a range interrupt, so it's really impactful. You have totems that can do a lot of different things. You can stop fears, you can ground casts. You have just a lot of different utility at your kit with the shaman, and where there's utility, there's also difficulty, because it means that you can have more impact on a game at any given time, which means that there's more technically mistakes that you can make at any given time, because, you could have done something there, you have a tool in your kit. So that's where the difficulty of Shaman comes from, not from its rotation, not from its defense, in my opinion, but mostly from its utility. Now, we also have in this, for basically the same reason, we have the Ret Paladin. Ret Paladin, again, damage-wise, it's pretty straightforward. You click the buttons to generate Holy Power, then use Templar's Verdict and deal a lot of damage. especially with your burst cooldowns. The difficulty for Ret Paladin, I think, comes from two things. It is being kited because you do not have a lot of mobility, as well as Again, very similar to the enhancement shaman, your utility, knowing when to use things like blessing of protection, sacrifice, sanct, things like that that you can use to assist your team, when to spend holy power and word of glory for your team versus Templar's verdict. Just knowing little things like that, little nuances throughout the game, I think is what gives Ret Paladin its difficulty. But I do think that in terms of just its overall damage and survivability, I don't think it's really too terrible. I think, like I said, the big thing and why it's in B tier with enhancement is for very similar reasons to enhancement, is mostly from a utility perspective and knowing when and how to use it. The next one on our list is going to be the Arms Warrior, and it's very similar to Ret Paladin and enhancement, with why I'm putting it in the B tier, where in terms of its overall rotation, I don't think it's terribly challenging. In terms of its defensive capability, you know, I don't think it offers anything super crazy, but where the difficulty lies is, again, very similar to the Ret and the enhance. Through the utility, you have, you know, arms in the past used to be just like a big damage bot, but it's not the case anymore. You have things like intervene, war banner, disarm, you have fear, spell reflect. You have all these different tools in the toolkit that you're now able to use. And again, where there are tools to use and opportunities to make plays, there's also opportunities to make mistakes. So because Arms Warriors now have a lot more ways to influence a game than they did in the past, it does give them a bit more difficulty than, let's say, something like a Havoc DH or a Frost DK, just because they can influence the game in more ways. But the reason that I don't think that they're A or S tier difficulty is because, again, I think offensively and defensively, they do have a bit of an easier time than other classes. Now, moving on to our A tier, I actually have Survival Hunter, I think, on my A tier for difficulty. The reason that I have Survival here is because it's a pet spec, just like Unholy, but Unholy can just resummon at school. Hooray, everything is fine. With the Survival Hunter, if you don't have your pet and you can't get a revive pet off, your class is basically dead in the water. So you have to treat your pet like it is just as important as you when it comes to staying alive. On top of that, you have a lot of tools for movement that you're able to use on the Survival Hunter. You can't just sit there and eat damage. You need to know when to go in, when to fight, when to kite. You need to, you know, get to healers for freezing traps, make sure that you land those properly. But for me, I think the big difficulty for Survival Hunter comes from the pet being such an integral part of your character. Like, so much of your class kit will be unusable if the pet dies. So for that reason, I do think that it makes it more difficult than other specs, because you really need to learn how to properly manage that pet and really keep it alive and know when to bring it in with you, when to kite it, when to reposition it to do things like Roar of Sacrifice for your teammates. There's just, I think, a lot of little nuances with Survival, which makes it a bit more challenging than I think the other specs I have on the B tier. Also on my A tier, and I know a lot of people are probably going to disagree with this, is I have Assassination Rogue. I personally think that some people I know have said Assassination Rogue they think is super easy, but I do think that it is a bit challenging. The reason that I think that is because it is still a rogue at the end of the day. While it is not, you know, a subtlety rogue in terms of difficulty, it is still I think a difficult class, not necessarily from the perspective of a rotation. In terms of the offensive rotation, I think it's relatively straightforward, which is why I think some people go, oh, the class is easy. But I think, again, the defensive knowledge on rogue, very important, because if you don't balance your movement with your cooldowns properly, you will just get exploded. Like, you'll just get evaporated. And on top of that, because rogues typically play in setup based comps, and as the rogue you're trying to do a lot of the setup for your team, you still got to know how to properly use your CC. And especially with assassination, it being much more limited than the subtlety rogue, you need to know when to use the crowd controls, when to set up your goes, when you can pull one off. And I think that macro level knowledge of knowing how and when to use your various forms of crowd control, being that that's the rogue's main job, I think is personally what puts it in the A tier for me. Again, I know some people might disagree with this and you could argue it is B tier, but I think that's what makes it a bit harder. In my opinion, it is still a rogue at the end of the day, and you do have that rogue skill cap that you need to basically adjust to if you want to find success with a rogue in any category. Also in my A tier, I actually have the Windwalker monk. So Windwalker, I think, is definitely got a skill cap to it, especially now that I've been playing one a lot more. The big thing with Windwalker that I think is going to separate a good Windwalker from a bad Windwalker is the defensive play. Offensively, once you get the rotation down pretty well, you are going to be absolutely blasting fools with ridiculous amounts of damage. The difficulty with the Windwalker comes entirely from, in my opinion at least, its defensive play. In terms of team utility, you do have some stuff with Vivify, Tiger's Lust. You can detox certain things off. You have Ring of Peace that you can make really interesting plays. But like I said, Windwalker defensively is the big challenge because its defensive cooldowns aren't all that great, and so you really need to know when it's appropriate to use a defensive cooldown in a certain situation or when it's just better to try to hightail it and run. And you also do have your port, but if let's say you place your port somewhere, forget to place it somewhere else as the game progresses and you go to port, you can put yourself in a bad location or away from your healer, and there's a lot to... I also feel that with the Windwalker Monk, you also really need to be very much aware of the game state defensively. Obviously, you need to for a lot of classes, but specifically for the Monk, if you don't save your trinket for the perfect CC, and if your healer gets locked down and you don't pre-port a go, if you don't pre-pop a defensive, you will get evaporated. So that's, like I said, the Monk has a lot of preparatory work for its defensives, and I think that's what makes it a bit more difficult than some of the other specs that I have on the B tier. For our S tier, I have the first one being Subtlety Rogue. Subtlety Rogue is definitely more challenging than Assassination Rogue for sure, because you have more crowd control that you need to manage, what gives it more of a macro level of difficulty, which is where the skill cap for the spec comes in. On top of that, because you are dealing all of your burst inside of goes, and outside of it, you don't really have that much. It requires a lot of macro knowledge, I think, to really play a Subtlety Rogue well, knowing when it's an appropriate time to do a go, getting triple crowd control on everybody, making sure you set everything up, getting into your dance and your blades, knowing when to bomb, knowing what to do, all of these different things, I think is what makes Sub Rogue definitely one of the more challenging specs in the game to play. There's a lot that you need to be able to read about the current state of the game, and because you have so many tools, like I've said so many times, that's what gives the class its difficulty. I also have Feral Druid in the S tier. I know some people are going to be like, oh, you only put it there because that's what you play, but I do think Feral is one of the more difficult melees into the game to play, very similarly to Sub Rogue. You do have a lot of CC at your disposal between Maim, Mighty Bash, Entangling Roots, and Cyclone. I think the big thing with Feral Druid and where its skill cap comes, for my opinion, is it is very similar to the Sub Rogue, where you deal most of your damage inside of burst windows. So you need to know when it's appropriate to pop your cooldowns to set up a burst go, because outside of your burst windows, you're not really dealing that much damage. The big skill cap for Feral is knowing the very intricate balance between shifting out of form to off heal, shifting out of form to clone, staying in form to deal damage, pre-bearing goes, like basically shifting between all of your different forms, because you have to be in human form to CC. So shifting between human, cat, and bear at appropriate times is definitely, I think, where it comes in. You do have bark skin for if you do get hit in a stun and don't have any damage reduction, but in today's meta, 20% isn't necessarily all that much. So you need to basically try to pre-bear goes, or make sure you save your trinket with survival instincts for if somebody you're getting prepped on to get hit. I think the skill cap for the class, and you still do have to kite too, very similarly to the Windwalker. You're tankier than the Windwalker though because of bear form, but still you do need to kite at appropriate times. You don't want to just sit in there and eat damage in bear form, or you'll just die a slow inevitable death. But for me, Feral Druid is very similar to Sub Rogue in the respect that you deal all your damage in goes, so you need to make sure you properly set those goes up, because outside of it, like, you don't really deal a whole lot of consistent pressure. Unfortunately, nowadays your damage is very confined to just like a consistent like Tiger's Fury type go. But the intricate balance between healing, cloning, cat, and bear, I think, is where the difficulty from Feral Druid comes, which for my opinion is why it's in the S tier. Now moving on to our range specs, I'm going to say for our, I don't think I have any, if I remember correctly, I have any C tier specs. I think I only did 3 tiers for range, with our first one being Marksman Hunter. Marksman Hunters have a very straightforward rotation, in my opinion. You also can move while you cast, with the exception of a couple of skills. You can't be interrupted on your cast, so you don't have to worry about things like kicks. You do have your pet to worry about to an extent, but not nearly as much as something like a survival hunter. You also, with Kyrian now, can basically shoot through walls, which is pretty cool. So I think the big thing with Marksman Hunter is just knowing, like, are you able to just set up a scatter on the a trap on the healer and a scatter on the off DPS, and then from there you just burst. It's really not, I don't think, super difficult. It's pretty straightforward, I think, and relatively easy to pick up. You have a lot of mobility and good ability to kite, especially with the Feign Death legendary. You could just make people's lives living hell. And so I don't think it's all too that challenging of a spec. I think it's pretty straightforward to pick up. Another one that I have is Destruction Warlock. Destruction Warlocks are just basically just turrets. You just sit there, you apply immolate to stuff, you build up shards, and you just fire off chaos bolts. You know, it's pretty much your thing to do. You use your fears as well to lock people down. You have really, really big burst. It's just Destro is very straightforward to play. It's just very much, you know, build up to your chaos bolts, CC the enemy team, cast chaos bolts. You know, relatively straightforward to play. You have a good bit of mobility now as well with the kit that Warlocks now have. That's, you know, could be where some skill cap comes in for sure, knowing when to properly kite it out now with your brand new mobility versus staying in and just trying to turret it out. But overall, I definitely think there are other range specs with more difficulty, which is why for me it's on my B tier. I also do have Boomkin in my B tier as well. I think the Boomkin rotation is pretty straightforward, especially once you learn how the different eclipse systems work. I don't think it's really all too challenging. Boomkins are also insanely tanky, especially inside of bear form, which is definitely something I think some people struggle with casters, that Boomkin doesn't necessarily suffer from as much, just because that you have that bear form to be tanky. But, you know, again, with Boomkin, you have to learn when it's appropriate to go into travel form and kite, or when you should just go into bear form and tank it out, or stay in Moonkin form and deal damage. But what makes the Moonkin a little bit easier than the Feral Druid, in my opinion, is that you can cast things like Regrowth and you can cast things like Cyclone while still in your Moonkin form. You don't have to shift out and totally, you know, negate your damage or position to still to do those other things, which is really nice. But Convoke is, you know, you get people lined up with CCA and you convoke the spirits. It's pretty, you deal a lot of damage. It's pretty straightforward to do, because that's your basic go with the Boomkin. You set up a root beam on the healer, and then you either pop Incarn and Convoke, or you could also use Fury of Elune and just deal a lot of damage and start dumping Star Surges. You know, the script for it is pretty simple, and is why I think I have it in my B tier. I do think though I have range in B tier and nothing in C tier, because with range there is still a bit of a skill cap that melee doesn't have of positioning. While melee positioning is of course important, you obviously don't want to line your healer over, push in for a kill and just die behind a pillar. Range positioning, in my opinion, is a little bit more difficult, because you really need to be in sync with your team and make sure you try to, especially as a range DPS, try to, you know, stay away from your healer in a lot of games, because you guys don't want to get, you know, double crowd control or cleaved, especially with you're playing a caster cleave. You want to try and keep that triangle formation going. So I do think casters have a little bit of extra difficulty of positioning that maybe melee don't have to worry about quite as much. In terms of our A tier, first one I have is Shadow Priest. The new Shadow Priest rework is definitely really, really nice. Shadow Priest deal a lot of damage now. Very, very good class. I think personally where the difficulty for Shadow Priest comes in is not necessarily from its rotation or from living, because Shadow Priests are not a very mobile caster, which means that they have the tools to live while basically standing still. The thing that makes Shadow Priest have its difficulty curve is the utility and crowd control. Very similarly to what I said in the melee section, with more utility comes more difficulty, comes more opportunity to make mistakes, and Shadow Priest can really influence a game in an insane amount of ways between its various utility and crowd control. So I do think for that reason it makes it a little bit more difficult than the other three specs that I have in the B tier. Of course, you know, Boomkin and Destro have, you know, spammable crowd controls as well, which, you know, adds some difficulty to them. But I think just the amount of tools in the toolkit that Shadow Priest has just makes it a little bit more challenging, which is why I have it in my A tier. It's also very, very, very difficult when you're just getting hyper trained out by melee. Not as difficult as it used to be. You have a somewhat more instant cast now, but, you know, Shadow Priests don't like being trained by melee. We also do have Ellie Shaman up in this A tier. Again, very similar to the Shadow Priest. You know, being trained by melee can sometimes be a little obnoxious, but it's the exact same reason. Tons of utility, tons of totems, tons of different ways that you can influence a game, therefore more possibility for mistakes. You also do have really good off healing as well, so knowing when to pop into that is really, really important. And I think the thing with Shaman too is just knowing when it's appropriate to go and when it's appropriate to burst. You don't want to just use your burst at a totally random time where you don't have any cross crowd control, because it'll totally just get negated and shut down. But if you can know, okay, you know, we have CC on the healer and the other DPS can't stop me, I am able to go, you have insane amount of damage. But like I said, I do think the difficulty just comes from the utility that it provides. Now, into our S tier, I have both mage specs. I think mage is definitely one of the harder specs in the game to play, very similarly to rogue, just because you do your damage pretty much in goes. Outside of your goes, you don't really do anything. So from a macro level, you do need to kind of be able to read the game state to know, okay, I need to get the crowd controls on these guys because it's time to burst. It's time to deal my damage. Because if you just fire off your damage at a random time where you're not prepped, like typically people at lower rating will do, you're just going to get totally shut down. You're going to get your combust purge. You're totally going to lose your entire go. And then you're going to be basically doing nothing until your next go. But I think with mage comes a mentality shift, because with a lot of other classes, you're able to still deal some damage outside of your specific goes with your burst cooldowns, but mage really isn't that way. Mage is just really kind of defined by those burst windows. And so when playing a mage, you kind of want to put yourself in the mindset of just stall. Use your tools in your kit to stall and kite and run away until you're able to go for another burst. But I think that's one of the things that makes it more difficult, between needing the macro knowledge to make sure you get all your CCs down and knowing when it's appropriate to burst, but kind of changing your mindset a little bit to know, okay, I have to just stall until I'm ready to go, and use your mobility to kite away from melee. Definitely think it makes it a little bit more difficult than some of the other characters in the game. You also do still have a lot of utility as well as a mage, so that is where some of the difficulty from the class comes from. And then also in my S tier, I actually have Affliction Lock personally. I think Affliction Lock right now is definitely one of the more difficult casters to play, because you're going to be super hyper focused, and you're not the tanky beast that you used to be. You're pretty squishy. So you need to really use all of the mobility in your toolkit to your advantage while trying to maintain dots on everybody to rot them down. Can be very difficult to get all of that going when you are being just absolutely punched by melee in the face. And I think that once you kind of get the mobility cadence of Affliction Warlock down, it becomes easier. But you also do need to keep in mind that right now, you know, Affliction, obviously because it's more dot pressure, plays more like a dampener. So you need to really be able to do these things for a good amount of time consistently every game, because you're not going to be, you know, bursting people down like you do with other specs. You know, you have to play games typically a bit longer, again, which means there's more room for mistake. So I think that like I said, that's the big thing that makes Affliction Walk difficult. You got to play it longer. You have to run a lot, all while trying to maintain your dots and knowing when to get CC on people, so you're able to actually get all that stuff out. So that's personally why I think Affliction is a bit more difficult right now. So that's my range tier list. Now moving into my healer list, by far most difficult healer is going to be our Resto Druid. Resto Druid's got a lot of tools in the toolkit that are like not related to healing because of all of the druid forms with having cyclone. You can cat weave. You need to pre-bear goes on yourself because you don't have a lot you can do if you don't. But the thing with Resto Druid that's hard right now is because it's hot based healing, and the meta is so bursty, and you don't have a lot of instantaneous burst healing. If you fall behind, if you don't pre-hot, pre-everything when it comes to someone doing a go, you're just going to fall behind and not be able to recover. Also, cat weaving is really important as well. It can be very, very good. And if it's something you don't know how to do properly, because again, during that time, you won't be healing, it can make the spec a lot more difficult to play. So being that you have a lot of crowd control you can do between cat form and cyclone, you know, being that you need to have a pre-defensive ready for people's goes, which means you really need to be good at reading the game state and being able to tell what's going to happen and when it's going to happen. It definitely makes it one of the more difficult healers, in my opinion, to personally play, especially because you're also like, you do, I think, could potentially need to be babysat if you get hard focused, if you have no more tools up and you're not good at kiting and bouncing in between all your different forms. So I definitely think it's one of the harder healers in the game. In terms of my A tier, I'm going to talk about these guys together, Disc Priest and Resto Shaman. The reason I have them in my A tier for difficulty is because they're the two offensive healers in the game. And I think with offensive healing specs and specs that can be really aggressive, comes that little dance of knowing, okay, when is it appropriate to just play super defensive, or when can I afford to be more aggressive? Both specs have purges. Shaman has a ranged kick, which means it can really make people's lives miserable. Hex is a really powerful CC that the Shaman has. Shamans, again, just like I mentioned with Alien Enhance, has a crap load of totems, which means that it is able to influence a game in a lot of ways. With Disc Priest, I think the difficulty comes from a big mindset shift from typical healers, because you're playing very proactive, kind of like with the Resto Druid. You need to get Atonement on everybody, get those shields up, and then just start trying to deal damage to keep everybody healed up through Atonement healing, and only really shifting into direct healing with stuff like Radiance and Shadow Mend when the situation desperately calls for it. Because with a Disc Priest, if you're not trying to use that really mana efficient Atonement healing and you're just going into your direct heals, you are going to like it's nobody's business. Also, Disc Priests do, I think, need to be babysat a little bit more when they are being attacked. They just can flop really easily if they don't have Pain Sup and Trinket. So it does, I think, make them a little bit more difficult between all the mana problems, having to be very proactive with damage-based Atonement healing versus direct healing. And then, like I said, with Shaman, just having all the totems, being able to offensively purge. And Shamans also can deal good damage too. So knowing when to even shift into doing things like Lava Burst definitely makes these specs a little bit harder. Wind Shear also for Shaman makes it a bit more challenging, because on top of managing healing totems, you also need to keep an eye out for things to kick. There's just, I think, a lot to worry about with these two specs that the other three healers that I have on my list don't really have. Now, in terms of my B tier, I have Mistweaver Monk. Assuming Mistweaver Monk isn't in a terrible state, I think it's one of the more easy specs to play, just because its rotation is pretty straightforward. You don't have to worry that much about dealing damage. The big tough part for Mistweaver, Mistweaver also has very good mobility, which helps, but the big tough part for Mistweaver, I personally think, is the fact that you do not have a lot of oh shit cooldowns. You have one big oh no cooldown, and if that is down, then you're not going to really be you can't save someone in an emergency. Also, I think one of the tough parts with Mistweaver right now, you die in trinkets without your trinket so easily. It makes it the spec really, really challenging at the moment from that regards. But I think, again, what makes it less challenging than Disc and Resto Sham is that you don't have to worry that much about dealing damage. Its overall rotation is really straightforward, and you don't have as many buttons, I don't think, as those other specs. So for me, the difficulty comes from just not just knowing when it's appropriate to use Life Cocoon, because it's your big and only stop, and using your mobility to keep yourself away from the enemies, because if you don't have that trinket, you're very much a kill target. I think another BT healer is going to be the Holy Priest. I think Holy is a little bit easier than Disc, just because it's more defensive than Disc. When it comes to healing, having that offensive defensive dance, I think for new healers could definitely be a bit challenging, but being that Holy Priest is a bit more defensive in nature, I think it makes it a little bit easier to play compared to the Disc Priest. You still have all of the same utility with things like mind games and your various crowd controls. This also has Holy Word Chastise, which is a stupidly powerful stun. But I just think because it's a more defensive version of the Healing Priest that focuses way more on just direct spot healing compared to the Disc Priest, which has this balance between Radiance and Shadow Mend and Atonement, I think Holy Priest is just a bit easier to play, which is why it landed in my B tier. And finally, our easiest healer by far is going to be the Holy Paladin. Holy Paladins do not have a crap load of hard casts. They have Divine Favor to cover themselves and give themselves basically Aura Mastery on demand. They also do have Aura Mastery, which can help them get heals off if they fall behind. But the thing that makes the Holy Paladin the easiest healer by far, in my opinion, to start up with is because you have an absolute myriad of reactionary cooldowns. I think healers that need to be proactive and read the game state, especially for newer players, are definitely going to be more difficult. But the good thing about the Holy Paladin is that you can use a lot of your cooldowns reactively. Okay, they're doing this, so I'm going to respond with this. Not they're going to do this, they are already doing it. You can respond with your cooldowns, and then you have such strong instant healing, you're able to get your teammates back up pretty easily. And then if you do need to hardcast heal, you can use Divine Favor, cover it with Aura Mastery, and you're it being Aura Mastery, not using Aura Mastery on top of it, you'll pretty much be good to go. So I think that's what makes it one of the easier healers in the game. You're also just not drowning in keybinds. So it's also really powerful right now. So it's definitely the easiest healer currently in the game to pick up. But guys, that is going to be it for me today. I know this video was a long one, but hopefully you guys did learn and pull something from it. I did try to cover all, melee, ranged, and healing with enough of explanation so that maybe if you're thinking about getting into PvP but want a class that isn't too challenging, hopefully I did a good job at explaining why. If you guys did find this video interesting and you did like it, please smack a like on it. Any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below. Let me know what you guys agree or disagree with about my tier list, but again, try to keep it civil. And if you guys do like these types of videos and want to see more, of course, hit that sub button as well as hit the bell. Keep notifications on so you always know what I'm doing here on my YouTube channel. Appreciate you all stopping by today, though. Thank you very much. As always, I'm Dots Gaming, and I'll see you all in the next one.